So thank you very much for filling up the hall post-lunch. Obviously, Yamini, you didn't feed them enough. Because usually after lunch, there's no life after lunch at conferences, but it's a tribute to our panelists and this subject, Indo-US relations. I know that we've seen the tamasha side or the spectacle side. It's funny that if you say tamasha, it sounds like it's a pejorative, but if it's a spectacle, it sounds like it's great. So tamasha as spectacle, if you prefer that, we've just seen. We are now discussing the more substantive issues in Indo-US relationship, which have come a long way. Just this morning, an article written by somebody I knew a long time back, who used to head the Asian Wall Street Journal's edit page out of Hong Kong, landed up in my inbox. And I thought it was a good article on how China is trying to blame America now for coronavirus spread. And I recalled in my conversation with her on email that in 1986 I wrote an op-ed for her on Indo-US relations, just over the excitement that Caspar Weinberger had made a few hours stopover in India. And that was a big story. And see now you have presidents and prime ministers flying in and out. So the two panelists are probably the best people to talk about this. Also, sort of serendipitously, both have a special connection to what's going on right now. Shivshankar Menon, who's our former national security advisor, and a China hand. So even coronavirus is coming out of there. And so you know how the Chinese do these things and how are they likely to handle it. And now we see this is becoming quite an America-China thing. And Professor James Steinberg and from University of Syracuse. He's a very eminent scholar. And again, in the description there, I find citizenship besides other things. And as we speak, this is just within hours of United Nations Human Rights Commission impleading itself as an intervener in the Supreme Court of India in the constitutional challenge to Citizenship Amendment Act. That is a big diplomatic story of the day. So in that backdrop, I have these two gentlemen. I will now shut up. I told them both they are disciplined and experienced, they are professional, and none of them is a politician. So once they get the camera, they'll not leave it. So each one of you, if you make a statement for 5-7 minutes on the general state of affairs in India-US relations. Professor Steinberg.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, and especially with a great friend and colleague, somebody who I have enormous respect for, Shekhar Gupta, who's really been a great leader, and India has been very privileged to have him in such important roles. So, yeah, I look forward to the conversation. So I just want to make 2 points. I first came to India in 1993. Just after I had been appointed to be the head of policy planning at the State Department. And at the time, I was working with Peter Tarnoff, who was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. And Peter said to me, you know, we really should spend a little more time thinking about India. He said, let's go. And so in the spring of '94, Peter and I came to Delhi to inaugurate the first policy planning talks between the MEA and the United States. And the goal was to have a strategic dialogue. And I won't pretend to you that it was very substantively successful, but it reflected, I think, a recognition which has been a long-standing recognition in the United States that there was something missing in the US-Indian relationship, and that surely more was possible than what we had been able to achieve. And I can say with confidence, and this is not, you know, a tribute to one administration or any others, but really lots of work of lots of people over a very long period of time, that if you look back at the state of US-Indian relations in '93 and '94 compared to today, it is a dramatic and wonderfully successful story. The transformation from one of suspicion and wariness and sort of what are you trying to do here and what's this all about anyway, which greeted us when we first came, is gone. And there are lots of issues and lots of complexities complexities in the relationship, but there's just no dispute anymore about how important the relationship and the need to have a sustained dialogue across a broad range of issues. And I credit all the administrations, from the Clinton administration, which I served in, to the Bush administration, and the enormous breakthrough with the nuclear deal, to what we tried to do in the Obama administration, and now with President Trump. So that trajectory is a very positive and very important one, and I think that it reflects a broad bipartisan consensus in the United States about the centrality of this relationship for a full range of issues. I always teach my students there are three baskets, right? There's security, economics, and values, and this is important across all three. That's my first point. My second point is to try to think and reflect a bit on what's just happened the last week. So one of the great things about coming to visit here is I get to read your newspapers and your commentary, at least the English print. And so I've been reading all the stories and all the commentary. And my favorite observation, which I read the other day, was in talking about the joint statement that was issued, that one of the commentators described it as semantically significant. I thought that was a great expression because we have this new comprehensive global strategic partnership. And so I think the real question now is, indisputably, the relationship has been deepening over time across a broad range of issues. But are we really at a different stage? And what would it mean for us to be at a different stage? And there are two things that have sort of stood out for me as I've reflected it since I arrived here. The first is a statement in the joint statement, not the global strategic partnership, but this idea of strategic convergence, right, which is very striking. Because if it is true that there's a strategic convergence between the United States and India, one asks the question, well, a strategic convergence about what? What is the strategy around which we've converged? And for me, that's a big question mark. And I think that we don't the two leaders have said we have a strategic convergence, but what is the strategy that we both share, both vis-a-vis this region, China, and the world? And does India really share President Trump's strategic vision, to the extent that he has one, which, so far as I can tell, is a vision of America first? And what would it mean for India to have convergence around Trump's view about each nation being for itself and out to achieve its own goals? If that's what we've converged about, which is possible, that has a lot of implications for where the relationship goes, but also the limits of the relationship. If it's every country first for itself, that's a form of strategic convergence, but it's not necessarily the form for a global comprehensive partnership. So that's the first observation. The second, which is equally significant, my perspective, was not from the joint statement, but by a statement by the Prime Minister, who said, at least according to the papers, that he described the U.S.-India relationship as the most important relationship of the century. And that's quite a significant statement, too. We were talking about the history of Indian foreign policy over the last 60 years, and 70 years. And it's quite stunning to think about in the context of the traditional Indian foreign policy to describe the relationship with the United States as the most important relationship of the century, right? It is a commitment to a kind of relationship and an alignment which historically has not been the case for India. And so the signal in that sense is a very powerful one about the fundamental importance that at least the Prime Minister puts on this relationship, and the willingness to proclaim to all the other partners that India has that America comes first. And to the extent that that's true, that is a change and has big significance for, I think, the evolution of this region. And so I'd be interested, Shekhar, your views about that, and whether this does really reflect a significant departure for India now in terms of thinking about its orientation towards the United States and the world.
Perfectly timed. And before Shankar starts, just a couple of takeaways from what you said. One, you said 93, you were heading policy planning.
Yep.
I think the period 93, 98, the 5 years was the worst 5 years in the post-Cold War history of Indo-US relations. So you had your job cut out. Because that was mostly Clinton one, ending with nuclear tests and the sanctions. That's one. Second, you talked about semantically significant. So people who write about these diplomatic things which sound so complex anyway, and where journalists don't know anything about what's going on. People write innovative stuff. So my favorite line of all times is Tashkent Agreement in 1966, one of our most eminent diplomatic correspondents, the kind of which has not yet been, never yet been again, nor will be. Described the handshake between Ayub and Lal Bahadur Shastri as a Himalayan handshake. Now we know that he meant it to be a compliment, but it wasn't very warm. I can tell you that. And third thing you were searching was strategic convergence. So it's a little facetious, but I'll say, given the way today's leaders are, strategic convergence and the shared strategic objective might just be to help each other win their elections. Having said that, Shankar, you speak the serious stuff.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for that. Right through what you were saying, I was thinking, my job's easy. All I have to say is I agree with Jim until the end when you ask me these questions. But what I'd like to do is to add to what you've said, because I think we've been lucky in the India-US relationship, in this whole transformation. Would not have been possible if we didn't have people like you who conceptualized the relationship, who could intellectualize about it. So now you can therefore afford to support each other's elections, do the tactical stuff, and a lot of the hard work has already been done. But I'm still an optimist, and not just still, I'm a long-term optimist, but even in the short term, because for me, convergence has actually grown over time. And now that we're willing to say so, to admit it, we've thought it for a long time, I think. Otherwise, we wouldn't have done the nuclear deal, we wouldn't have done all the things we did. And the US wouldn't be the biggest partner in terms of military exercise, a huge source of defense equipment. We wouldn't have the kind of interoperability now that we have, all this counterterrorism, you name it. We work together in a whole host of sensitive things. We wouldn't have arrived here if we didn't actually think we had convergence. I think the problem is that in the public mind, convergence is China. And we've been there before. If you look at the late Eisenhower's, the end of Eisenhower's administration and the beginning of JFK's, and the relations went up, but then, by the mid-60s, Vietnam War, a whole series of domestic things in India, and it went down. And this time is different. And Tanvi Madan's book, which is the PhD you made her do, I think, that argues the case very well. But if you look at us today, actually this relationship walks on many legs now. It's not just China or the view of the region. When we say Indo-Pacific, I think it's a sort of inchoate expression of the kind of region we'd want, an open region which is not centered on any one power, and I think that's actually coming about. If you look at the distribution of power in the Asia Pacific, it's not just China that's rising, there are other powers rising as well, and the balance of power is shifting very rapidly, but it's shifted in favor of several other countries. So it is a more multipolar system, at least in this part of Asia, India eastwards. And that's one point of fundamental convergence. We now have an economic relationship that really matters. We've gone from $11 billion in 1995 to now the US is our biggest trading partner. There are things, I think, where we need to be a little more coordinated. But these are not new problems. Iran, for instance. Even during the Bush administration, when they were pushing against Iran international sanctions, but the Bush administration saw the point, from our point of view, that we needed to do Chabahar, we needed access to Central Asia, Afghanistan, and was willing to turn a blind eye to what was going on. I'm not sure if that has changed today in the US. But as long as we cut each other enough slack to deal with issues like that, where we might have a slightly different emphasis. We don't sit behind the two biggest oceans in the world. So we don't have the luxury that you have. For us, if anything goes wrong around Iran in the Gulf, 7 million Indians work there, that would be disastrous, the consequences. So there are issues like that, but it seems to me we now have developed enough habits of cooperation that we can handle these things. And from what I can see in terms of maritime security, the whole maritime domain, I think there's much more that we're doing together than we've ever done before. And that's only going to grow. I don't see that diminishing. So I'm a long-term optimist. Now, there will be hiccups. And I think the problems come when either of us decides we want a monogamous marriage, this is where, if we say don't talk to Pakistan, or, the US says don't you dare talk to Iran, or, and we will have differences, I think, on Russia, for instance. But I think we can live with all this. Certainly for Indians, we're used to multiple identities and to a whole different set of, a plural sort of world. So I don't think there's anything that I can see right now that can actually reverse this.
I think
now, where should India be in this from an Indian point of view? Even if you were Bismarck, you would say India should be closer to both the US and China than they are to each other. That's the logical, I guess Kissinger would probably say that too. But that's the cold one. That doesn't include the values, the other things, the Indian diaspora in the US, a whole set of other factors. People sell real estate in Gurgaon here with, Palm Beach, Orange County. What does it tell you? It tells you there's a middle class out there.
By the way, in Bangalore, they have 110 Downing Street also. It's an apartment building.
That's ambition.
Yes.
So therefore, I'm an optimist, and I'm just trying to list all the things to support what you said.
And I just finish the thought. I think that my only concern is that perception or that characterization that you've just given is understood on our side, right? Because there's a risk.
Even if it isn't, luckily you've got checks and balances.
That's true.
So if one part of the system is not working, there's always 10 other places. There are people sitting in this room who've actually built this relationship, Sham, Navtej, and I'm sure he spent a lot of time wandering around town, going around the states, doing, working with corporations, with whoever.
So each one of you, just spend 1 minute giving your definition of what you see as the strategic convergence.
I like Shankar's characterization, which is that I think that the one thing that is broadly shared in the American strategic community is this idea of an open international system in which no one dominates, and that there's freedom of countries to pursue their interests without coercion, without others trying to impose their will. And I think that is a very strong basis for shared convergence, because it isn't one of anybody trying to dictate the order, but rather recognition that the order has to be open to a variety of perspectives. It's also attractive if taken in those terms, because it isn't necessarily an anti-China thing. It sets the rules of the system which China can decide to either participate in or resist, but it's an open feel for China, if it accepts the idea of an open Indo-Pacific, to participate in it. So I think that's an opportunity for strategic convergence that can be broadly shared and puts us on the high ground for leadership based on the rule of law and respect for a diversity of views. And if it then allows us to exert both global leadership as well as regional.
Shankar?
Well, as I said, for me it's the open system, it's the idea of I think the problem is that we're so used to the Cold War that we now think that Sino-US contention is back to US-Soviet, which it isn't. I don't think China can be contained by anybody today. The US and China are linked.
Because China is a much bigger economic power than the Soviet Union ever was.
And she's also part of the world economy. Yes. She's a big factor in the world economy, which the Soviet Union never was on that scale at all. And so I think for all of us, this is really an intertwined, globalized world for the first time. And in that kind of world, I think it's important that you actually work to keep it open. So more than half our GDP is the external sector. And how many Indians realize that?
Absolutely, and in fact, you said Indo-US trade was 11 billion. I think, if I remember,
it started at 11 billion.
Started
now
11,
it's 163 or something.
No, I think it's 140 something now. Yes, and they're aiming for it to be 400 billion. So it's a lot. Yeah. But that's also because how India's economy changed after 1991. Some of which might be reversed as we look as we see the new nationalism. Now, there is an issue here. The issue is that in India, this government has come in. It's at least there for 4.5 years, right? I mean, to say that in the city that it's there for 4.5 years would sound like I'm predicting it won't be there after that, but I'm saying at least 4.5 years,
Okay.
right? In the US, we don't know what happens. We can't be sure.
Well, some people have made a bet already.
Yes. So that's the question. One, is that the right bet to make? Because as a journalist, as a political journalist, I would never call an election. Because when journalists call an election, they are exactly the opposite is bound to happen. Right? So I don't know if you pundits are better with experience. Second, this is not a Republican administration in America. It's a Trump administration. So how strong Trump is, in any case, he can't be there for more than 4.5 years. I'm saying Modi there at least 4.5 years, Trump there not longer than 4.5 years. After which some normalcy returns in America. So how do you, I mean, how institutional are these commitments now when bipartisanship seems to be dying? And if I may push the envelope, when our government at this point seems to have dismissed bipartisanship as an obsolete idea. So each one of you.
So I think it's a huge.
You can disagree with anything I'm saying.
I mean, it's not a question of predicting what's going to happen. I think that even if the leadership here were confident that Trump was being reelected, the worst thing you could do is to bet on one party or the other, simply because the long-term strength depends on the relationship not being seen as a loyalty to one party. It damages the sustainability of the relationship to do that. And so, I mean, I have no problem with, and I welcome the fact that the leadership here gives our sitting president a warm welcome. It should give a sitting president, but it shouldn't be seen as campaigning for that president. And I think that, and the converse is equally true. I mean, I think one of the things, and it was a challenge for us when we came into office with President Obama, there were lots of questions about Mr. Modi and about, the issues that are debated here. But, one of the things you have to accept, especially in a democracy, is that we don't get to pick. And I think one of the strengths of what we did during the Obama administration was to respect that choice that was made here. And so I think it's really critical to the long-term relationship that the leadership here doesn't tie the relationship to the fortunes of one particular candidate or one particular party.
I couldn't agree more. I've said in public before that I think we need.
But this is dangerous. Indians and Americans agree on everything like this.
This is a transformed relationship.
This is the binary.
This is congruence.
Right.
Strategic, global, comprehensive
global strategic partnership.
In action. No, I think some of the things we've done recently maybe have affected that, but I think we need to work to bring it back to bipartisanship, not only in the US, but in India as well. Now, we've had divisions.
I think might be easier to do it in US than India.
I'm not sure. You think back to the civil nuclear and a vote of confidence and what the BJP was saying about the civil nuclear deal in the opposition. And the moment they came to power, suddenly...
This is like Jahangir invited the British in, so India became a slave of Britain for 200 years. That is what was said by Sushma Swaraj in Parliament on the nuclear deal.
1,000 years of Gulam.
Yeah, on the nuclear deal, yes.
Yeah. But, I mean, once they came to power, they were reasonable. And I think that's the point. If you're Democrats at home, then you understand that you will have to deal with all sorts of people.
But these Democrats are more ideological now.
Let's see as the Chinese have a good saying,
Yes.
I mean, listen to their words, but watch what they do.
Yeah.
That's an important one.
So,
something that's always fascinated me, Clinton 1 and Clinton 2, you were there. So from the worst possible relationship to this dramatic turnaround, the easing of the sanctions, and then this big honeymoon and Clinton coming up here within a year of the nuclear tests and wagging his finger at the Pakistanis and saying that lines on the map of the world, of the subcontinent, cannot be redrawn in blood. What happened?
So
because then we will know how Washington changes.
I mean, but I mean, it's history, but it's worth going back to the history, which is that President Clinton, from the outset, and I can say this with confidence, having been there from the outset, really aspired to have a stronger relationship with India. But he also had a very strong commitment to the nuclear nonproliferation regime. And there was a tension there. And it was a problem that was a difficult problem to square the circles on, which is at a time when we were focused on the end of the Soviet Union, trying to make sure that we had written a final chapter with bringing the Ukrainian nukes back, the Kazakhstan nukes back, trying to move to a less nuclear world, to pursue that agenda and to pursue an agenda with India, and the desire to try to do both at the same time, which proved unsustainable. The tensions between the two, and ultimately a choice had to be made. And I think it tells you a lot about President Clinton, that at the end of the day, when the choice had to be made, he chose for the relationship and not for the kind of purity around the NPT. It was a hard decision for him because it was something that was important to him and important to people in his administration. You take somebody like Bill Perry, who had a strong commitment to India, but also had a deep, from his own experience, strong commitment to the NPT. And so for the first 5 years, we tried to ride both horses. Kind of a very strong principled commitment to not undermining the NPT and trying to build a relationship with India. It proved impossible, and it all fell apart in 98, and we saw it all fall apart in 98. And then I think it's to the credit of the president that he said, it's counterproductive for me to continue to do this. What's happened has happened. We need to move on from here. And I think, he, in some ways, he was liberated by that, to be able to say, okay, I tried to sustain a more principled view of the NPT, but it's not going to happen. I can adjust to the realities, and now there is an opportunity to move forward with the bilateral relationship.
So let's stay in Washington. How is a Trump policy-making establishment different from any other?
Because there's no policy-making establishment. There's
So how does this work? I mean, any commitments made, any promises made? Because he can change them anytime. Today he's talking to North Korea, tomorrow he's fighting with North Korea, today he's fighting with China, tomorrow he's not fighting with China, today he's breaking talks with the Taliban, tomorrow he's siding up with Taliban.
But he'll be the only US president in this century, in fact, for a long time, who wouldn't have started a new war. So I think this image of Trump as being unpredictable, dangerous, I think he's fundamentally conservative. He wants to bring the troops home. He has, let's not say he has a vision or he has a grand plan, strategy, but he certainly has instincts. So, and those instincts, from an Indian point of view, are not all bad. Many of the things he said, improve relations with the Russians, get the troops home, end the wars. These are sensible things that he's saying. The trouble is he says it in ways which arouse all kinds of opposition.
But he wants retweets.
And he makes it.
So he needs retweets. So he has to say these things in his own way.
I think we should stop analyzing Trump the way we used to analyze previous cerebral presidents. I think we need to look at it differently.
Well, I think similarly we should stop analyzing Mr. Modi as we used to analyze the previous, maybe not as cerebral prime ministers. I think I'm okay with that.
I certainly agree. I mean, I do think that he is significantly risk averse. And we've seen this. Look at the issues around Iran. You mentioned Iran. I mean, you have a very strong rhetorical position here. But every time we've come to the brink of potential confrontation with Iran, he's pulled back. And so I agree with that. I mean, there are many things that I fundamentally disagree with the president, but I don't think he's reckless. I think he actually understands that the single biggest threat to his reelection is getting us involved in a war. And so, why does he continue to praise where we're going with North Korea after we made no progress at all? It's because he doesn't need this to be a crisis. So I agree with that. I think the problem, though, and I think it should be considered to be a problem here, and I'll be blunt about this one, is that at the heart of his view is something he's very explicit about, which is this idea of America first, which is we're in this for ourselves, and we will do what is best for us. And he has a pretty narrow conception of what that is, which is best for ourselves, which means that even for countries with whom we have very strong, important shared interest, they don't get very special consideration, and you see what's happened in our relationship with other key traditional partners of the United States. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of sense of the fact that, yes, you can go for some short-term gains, but what does that do to the long-term relationship? And so we'll see what happens in the U.S.-Indian relationship, but it has been difficult for our traditional partners, especially our values partners like Europeans, like Japan, like Korea, like Australia, to have the confidence that we will take into account those broader shared interests as we develop the relationship. And so that's the one feature that I think is consistent about the president, which is, it's what have you done for me lately?
Yeah. But this is a problem we today have across the world with most of the new authoritarians. They have no performance legitimacy because they make huge promises, don't deliver. And therefore they rely on nationalism, ultranationalism, xenophobia for their legitimacy. And so it's not just, an India-US problem.
And local populism.
Well, populism, no, because then you're handing them the populace. So that's a wrong word, I think. But anyway, that's a different argument. So it seems to me the problem is that the space for negotiation, diplomacy, for the give and take, the bargaining that is an essential part of peaceful resolution of issues is actually shrunk because of this. And it's not only in the US. I mean, Trump is actually the last of the series that started in 2012.
Yep.
And, going west from Japan to China to us to everywhere. So it's a more general, systemic problem now. And that, I think we have to just take it as part of the environment, the new environment. Therefore, we will solve nothing. But we can hope to manage because they're risk averse, because they have tied foreign policy into domestic politics, which cuts the foreign policy elite out, but at least it restrains them from getting into the kinds of wars and things interventions that their predecessors used to do.
So let me push you on this point. You're saying Trump has cut the foreign policy elites out?
Not him, not just him. I mean, all of them. And
all of them, including Mr. Modi.
Yes, hard work, not Harvard. But he is, I think, what he said. But then you look where the whole BJP, RSS leadership sends their children to study.
Well, I mean, we ran that story yesterday,
yes.
and I'm paying for it since last night because I've been trolled, including my minister's children saying, look at me, I got such good marks, I got to this place on my own. So to which my reply should have been, and I'm holding fire, my reply should have been, then why are your parents ruining the 2 or 3 great universities we have? Out of which most of them came. So, because they can afford to see their children go to fine universities overseas, which they can't ruin. But anyway, that's a digression. We've come 32 minutes into this session. We'll soon take questions from the audience, so please keep them ready. But second, 32 minutes into a 60-minute discussion on Indo-US relations, and no P word and no A word. Either we've had too much to eat at lunch, or the world has really changed. So Pakistan and Afghanistan. I am personally fascinated by the calm with which India has responded to the Afghan situation. Normally you would have expected some neurosis. Americans have dumped the Afghans, they're going away, and what will happen now? But it's a different situation. So what exactly has happened in Afghanistan? How does it affect India? How do we analyze? We understand America's motivations, although I think I was also tempted to say this morning, every day I save my life by not saying 10 things I want to say. So I wanted to say that the US Taliban peace deal has had a shorter shelf life even than the Indian left liberals' love for Arvind Kejriwal. Right? But I didn't say it.
So can I just...
Sure.
For me, India has a Pakistan problem. It doesn't have an Afghanistan problem. For a long time...
Not this Afghanistan problem.
Even for a long time, people have been saying, Afghanistan will go down the tubes and we're going to be hit. We don't get hit. There's Pakistan between us and Afghanistan.
Exactly.
Pakistan gets Talibanized, not Afghanistan.
But before that, Pakistan has to settle the Durand line.
Look at how many Afghan terrorists have we seen in India? 1 in 40 years.
Yes.
Why are we yelling and screaming? We got a free war. The US fought our war against extremists for 19 years. We got it for free. Say thank you. If they want to go home, why should we be stopping them? So I don't understand why people panic about what's going on in Afghanistan. Afghanistan itself will evolve. It is different today from where it was in 2001. There's no question.
That's what Shivshankar also said yesterday, that this is not the same Afghanistan.
No, it might revert to historical type where, power gets distributed down to various regional, whatever, leaders, tribal, etc., regional warlords, whatever, with a weak Kabul, which is the traditional pattern. But it's the one country that's never had a separatist movement. It's full of minorities, and it's never actually, because everybody else has an interest in Afghanistan existing. The Iranians don't want all those Baluchis on their hands. The Pakistanis don't want the Pathans, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's so. Frankly, I'm not sure why we should be so worried. We should worry about the real problem, which is Pakistan, which is not a problem that we have the power or capacity to solve. That the world's greatest power tried, working on education, on various good things in Pakistan, didn't work. The Chinese are now running up with CPEC. They see the problems in what they're doing. So that's the problem we should focus on, to my mind, rather than getting so involved in, will the peace work? Will the Taliban keep their word? Of course they won't. But since the president needs to get out of Afghanistan, he will act as if they did keep their word. And he'll go home. And let's live with it.
I mean, first of all, this is one, there are a lot of issues that are controversial between Trump and the opposition. Then I say this is one that's not controversial. There are no Americans for staying. It's just, we've done what we can, and I think that people have you can
so
debate.
this is like Vietnam 73.
It is in that sense. I mean, I think that there is a sense, it is different. We did make a difference in some ways. We didn't accomplish everything we wanted, but we certainly recognize the limits of what we can accomplish, and so it's unrealistic to ask Americans to continue to sacrifice for something where we no longer are able to make much of a difference. I think there's some debate in the United States about whether we could have been more engaged with the Afghan government in this process. I mean, I do feel, I'm not directly involved, but I do feel that there was a certain level of sort of, indifference to their views. Understand that they could not have a veto over our leaving. We were going to make that decision, but I still think there were ways to be more respectful of them as a partner in this rather than as an afterthought. Nevertheless, it wouldn't have made a big difference in any event because there's a limit to what the Taliban would have accepted in terms of engaging with Ghani. So I think the question now becomes, thinking about this is a reality that we're coming out, what do we together need to do to deal with what the situation will be afterwards, which I think is an important partnership, that we need to sustain that, but accepting the reality that there isn't an option of anything other than the United States withdrawing, and the question is how do we then manage it?
No, I think you're absolutely right.
And I'm looking for
and
questions
frankly, I
from the
think the
audience.
other powers around Afghanistan will now have to step up and take responsibility to do some of the things that the US was doing for them free.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting that you said Afghanistan is a country of minorities, because I used to cover Afghanistan as a reporter. It's a fascinating thing about Afghanistan is that for every tribe or community that's found there is a larger number in the adjoining country. So it's a unique country. So questions from the audience, please raise your hand and ask a question. In the back first. Let's start from the back. Please introduce yourself and ask a short question.
Am I audible? Good afternoon. My name is Vishnu Priya. I'm a research fellow with the British Council and University of Oxford. My question is primarily directed towards Professor Menon. Like you rightly pointed out, our strategic relationship with the United States is crucial, but seeing President Trump's increased personal economic investment, his non-committal attitude picking between India and Pakistan, calling them both friends, how difficult is it going to be to maintain a measured distance from the United States to pursue our domestic and foreign policy in India's interests? Specifically with regard to India protecting its poultry and dairy industry, which has been a long-standing grouse, and tariffs as well.
Well, I think the economic issues, a lot depends on our making up our own mind about how engaged we want to be with the world. The signs are not good recently. We opted out of our CP, we've raised customs duties for the last 4 years, etc., etc. But that's a choice that we have to make, and then we'll choose. And because we know how important the relationship is with the US, I hope that it actually leads us to the right decisions on the economic side. So that's a hard one to predict. I don't want to predict. But on the Pakistan thing that you mentioned, frankly, once the US withdraws from Afghanistan, US interest or need for Pakistan declines considerably. And that was one difference when, even in the past, we've seen this happen before, where you shed this millstone of the US reliance on Pakistan, India-US relations do very well. So in fact, that's another reason actually to welcome what's going on in Afghanistan.
Actually, that's a question that I will follow up on. Is a better, both of you, is a better US-Pakistan relationship good for India, or is a strained US-Pakistan relationship good for India?
I think it's good that it's in India's interest that we have some relationship with Pakistan. I mean,
I think we should have some relationship with
Pakistan. And I think that our level of influence is fairly modest. I mean, we've certainly come to understand that over the years. And I think I've worked for several presidents who've tried very hard to find ways, as Shankar suggested, in terms of investing in economic development, energy development, and the like in Pakistan as a way of trying to build confidence that we have more than an instrumentalized relationship with Pakistan. It hasn't worked very well, right? And I think we shouldn't turn our backs. We have humanitarian interest. We have interest in not having Pakistan completely fall apart. But I don't think it's in anybody's interest for Pakistan to feel abandoned by others. And certainly, I don't want to get into too much geostrategic competition, but there's some value in Pakistan not being totally dependent on China for everything, right? I mean, it is in everybody's interest that Pakistan have options in that respect.
Well, I'll come at it the other way. For me, best dehyphenation, because that leaves you free to deal with the issues as they arise. And you pick and choose what you do. You choose with the US, work together. It frees you in a sense. But if, as we have done in the last few years, you choose to hyphenate, then certainly some US influence. But I think we need to know that there are limits to how far that works. We know the nature of Pakistan. And as I keep saying, it's a Pakistan problem for us. It's not a problem that you can solve through the US or through China or through anything else. Ultimately, we have to deal with it. And it's time, 70 years after partition, it's time to grow up, I think.
I think, if I can add a line to that, for us, the Pakistan problem also is that Pakistan has got hyphenated with Indian domestic politics. So that has now become a complication. So, ma'am, and because the question you asked in the back about dairy and agriculture, please also remember that while you protect these industries, dairy and poultry, essentially, there is also someone at the other end of this equation who's much more numerous, and that is the consumer.
Correct.
So if consumer is the king, then market should be allowed to be freer than they are, ma'am. That's my view. Not.
My name is Ross, and I'm the CEO of the Lecture. One very crucial question is India, could India's role in negotiating the Iranian nuclear deal, especially in the aftermath of General Soleimani's assassination? And that leads into how these particularly changes in internal Indian security policies will be viewed by the Indo-American policy watchers, who will possibly create the new foreign policy, perhaps with the Democratic president.
So, I think Shankar's earlier comment about Iran is a very important one, which is that, the U.S. policy has to be mature enough to recognize that even our global comprehensive strategic partners don't always agree with us, and they have interests which are not identical with ours. And I think this is something, I spent a lot of time dealing with the Iran issue, not so much directly with Iran, but with our partners, Japan, which has considerable interest in Iran, India, and others. And when I first came back to the Obama administration, and one of my early trips was to Japan, and I met with my Japanese counterparts, and I said, "How can you do this, right? We're trying to put pressure on Iran, and you're still," and they said, "We get it, right? But we have our own imperatives here. We have to find a way to try to be respectful of each other's interest here." And friends treat friends with respect, even if they disagree. And I think we learned that over the course of this, and that we ended up getting much better cooperation from India on this when we stopped being, insistent that it's our way or the highway. And so I think we are a big and powerful country, but we also need others to work with us, which means we have to be more accommodative. And we get into trouble when we unilaterally do things like withdraw from the JCPOA and then insist that everybody else go with us, right? I don't agree with the decision to withdraw, but even if we were going to withdraw, we have to respect the fact that others don't share that view. And so it's important for the United States in terms of our own global leadership that we have strong views. We will try to be persuasive with others about that, but we have to find ways to accommodate the situations when our persuasion fails.
Question in the back, yes.
Hi, my name is Prachur, and my question is for Mr. Steinberg and Shekhar Gupta.
Not for me. Ask them questions.
So my question is regarding the Green New Deal.
Can I be next?
And how it has animated at least the Democrat politics and maybe Bernie Sanders' rise. So I want to sort of understand what can India learn and Indian parties maybe learn from the Green New Deal.
It's a very complicated question because the Green New it's the Green and the New Deal, and there's an overlap between the Green part and there's not an overlap. And the set of policies that are incorporated within the Green New Deal address a range of things which are only loosely related to each other. There's a green agenda, which is quite important, and there's a economic transformation agenda that has to do with inequality and the structure of the US economy agenda. And some of them appeal to different parts of the different constituencies, which is why the broad concepts are broadly accepted within the Democratic Party, but a lot of the specific proposals are not, because many of them are more statist than a lot of Democrats feel, and many of them are frankly unrealistic in our political system and are more kind of campaign-oriented rather than practical governance issues. So I think that there's a core of principles behind it, which is that we need more environmentally friendly policies, we need more worker-friendly policies, we need to deal with some of the fundamental inequalities, structural inequalities in our society, which are shared broadly within the Democratic Party, but a lot of division about the specific proposals that are contained in that, manifesto.
Okay, question, but I think this was showing 15 minutes and now it's showing 0. So, okay, 2 more questions. Okay, the gentleman here, because we haven't had enough questions from this side. But I saw one hand, your hand, yes. After that, please pass the microphone to her.
Good afternoon, Vinay from Shivshankar School of Public Policy. My question is...
A little bit louder and closer to the microphone.
Aren't we underestimating the structural change in terms of deglobalization over the last decade around the world, in terms of Brexit or the sentiment in Italy and southern European nations against EU, the sentiment in the United States also against integration with the rest of the world. So Trump or Brexit, this represent the structural underlying forces against deglobalization. So if you could address that, thanks.
I think, coronavirus shows you that we're still a globalized world. I mean, you've seen the effect. You've seen what's happened to your stock markets, I think there is no decoupling. We might say deglobalization, but if you look at the proportion of world trade to GDP, that's barely, we're now back to 2008 levels, actually. We went down, but we're back up. Yes, the US and China are onshoring production. US at the higher, very high value-added levels. China at some of the lower levels. And those production chains have shrunk over the last few years, since 2008 actually. So it's not so much the deglobalizers as the crisis in 2008. But there's only limited scope, I think, for them to actually decouple from the world. And we see this in every relationship, that the dependence on each other is tremendous. Look at us, 80% of our imports are maintenance imports. You will have to buy energy, oil, you will have to buy fertilizer, you buy moong dal. I mean, you're not going to survive without these things. So for me, this is not going to be a deglobalized world. You're not going all the way back. You might evolve into a differently globalized world, but not. What do you think, Jim?
I'm a little more pessimistic, I have to say. I mean, part of the reason I actually
I'm an old
share.
man. I'm not going to be here when all this happens. So.
Little less optimistic.
You know, part of the reason, I mean, I do share a lot of your concerns, and part of the reason we didn't address it here is because Ambassador Sarn and I talked about it at some length yesterday. I am worried about the renationalization, and I regrettably, I think that what's happening with the coronavirus is actually accentuating that, because what people are saying now is that there's too much vulnerability, and we're seeing global supply chains being disrupted by coronavirus, so the best way to do this is to insulate ourselves and to renationalize production. I mean, even most dramatically in terms of active pharmaceutical ingredients, right, which we're now very dependent on China, and people say, oh my God, you know, we can't do that. And, you know, so, I mean, I agree with you that there's a limit to how far this can go, but I think there's an awful lot of momentum behind this that is looking at vulnerabilities and looking at risks and looking at costs, and it's the left and the right. I mean, this is one place where the left in the United States and the right agree, which is that we're too exposed and there are too many costs to American society. And so I think that there are going to be a lot of strains, and I think that the backlash against these vulnerabilities, and some of which are inherent in globalization, some of which is because we've managed globalization badly. But I do see, I mean, it's not going to be pure decoupling, but there's going to be an awful lot of energy put into these reconceptualizations that see the risks rather than the benefits. And I think it's very dangerous. I mean, one, it's going to have a huge impact on global growth. I think, you know, we're already in a question that Larry Summers has raised about, you know, what the future of growth is, and this is going to hurt this even more. Yeah. But worse, it leads to a much more zero-sum conception of everybody's interests. And coupling that with America first, Britain first, Brexit, as you say, and other things, you know, it creates a much more volatile international environment. I mean, yesterday the argument was, well, even globalization didn't prevent World War I. That's true, but imagine without these interconnections how much more fragile the situation would be.
Well, I mean, my experience I think many would agree that the ideas on which the left and the right both agree most strongly are the worst ideas. So, I think okay, it's okay. We'll take. Go ahead. Last question.
Question is for Steinberg. So,
closer to your.
The current economic slowdown caused by the coronavirus in China, do you think it will make China vulnerable in the US-China ongoing trade talks? And for Menon, so does this current slowdown in China offer us an economic opportunity for India to grow closer to the US economically?
You know, I think it's very hard to say, because it's not clear to me what the administration's ultimate objectives are in the trade talks, right? I mean, if you look at the interim agreement, I mean, it's a very shallow agreement. It produces some near-term benefits for the United States, but it doesn't go to some fundamental questions. You know, and I think that ultimately we have some leverage over China under these circumstances, but you know, I would like to see it leveraged around really systemic addressing of the problems in the way China runs its economy, which is not just a bilateral US-China relationship. It has to do much more with China's role in the global trading system, trade and investment system, and that we ought to be working more closely with other partners to try to define the terms about sort of revitalizing the rules-based system, rather than just trying to get short-term deals for us out of this, which actually weakens the overall system.
To the other question, can India replace China in the US in economic terms? I'm not so sure, because you need to match factor costs in China, which are low, and everything you're doing actually is raising those, whether it's land, whether it's capital, whether it's the cost of all these in India today. And even labor is not cheap because productivity is so low. So I'm not sure that you can, and it's not automatic. None of this will just happen automatically because of what happens between China and the US. So for me, if you want to do that, you'd better step up your game. You have to, there's a lot of things that we need to do.
Well, I think we have to conclude this. All I can tell you is for India to decide, first of all, to take advantage of this, the cabinet has to decide. Then a group of secretary has to present a paper. Niti Aayog will examine it. It will go back to cabinet as a cabinet note. Then a group of ministers will be set up. By that time, this crisis hopefully will be over, which will be good for all of us. So thank you very much. It's been a wonderful session. And a special applause of both our panelists who've been so disciplined and so clear-headed. So once again,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for running it. Thanks, Jim.
Great.